So we're going to go over senses, sense organs, and general senses in this chapter. So when we look at a sense, it is taking the world around us and the signals that we receive from there and actually making a perception from the nervous system and the central nervous system of what those senses mean. And we're going to start off by looking at what we call general senses. And so these are things such as visceral sensations like hunger and thirst, touch, temperature, pain, and then proprioception. When we look at our senses, there's going to be 4 different categories that our senses are stimulated through. The first one is mechanical, so this is actually pressure against sensory nerves. Things like touch, hearing, and balance. Hearing ends up being from sound waves that actually put pressure up against the eardrum, and then that sound wave is transmitted into the inner ear where there's going to be special nerves that are going to take that energy from the sound waves and transmit them into an impulse the brain can actually interpret as sound. And then also in that same inner ear, there's actually going to be specialized nerves that are going to be involved with feeling position of the head and knowing what the balance is. We have thermal, which is temperature, which is simply being able to feel hot and cold. We have electromagnetic, which is actually looking at photons of light, such as you do with vision by looking out of your eyes. And then we have chemicals, and so this is actually molecules that land on specialized nerves that can sense what those molecules are, and these are things like taste and smell. So when we get to general senses, we end up having 5 general senses in the body. We have visceral sensations, so this is things like hunger, thirst, and then emptiness and fullness of organs like the bladder or your stomach. Things like hunger and thirst are usually chemical or can also be mechanical, whereas organ fullness is going to be mechanical. We have touch, which is actually having something touch or put pressure against the body, and that is a mechanical. It's going to actually put pressure against a nerve. We have temperature, which is hot and cold, which ends up being a thermal sense. So the body has special nerves in the epithelium that can sense heat and cold. There's also receptors in the body that will actually monitor things like your core body temperature. We have pain, which is an intense stimulation of specific nerves in the body that are looking for injury or inflammation and mounting a response to that. This can be mechanical, such as getting a cut. This can be chemical, from something like a chemical burn, or from an infection where we end up getting things like inflammatory mediators released that's a chemical reaction. And then thermal, so like burns. And then we have proprioception, knowing the body's position and the position of all the limbs and different components of the body, and then the body actually through movement. And this is also a mechanical. So when we look at visceral, this is a miscellaneous category of the interior of the body. This is going to be involving the thorax, so things like the lung and the lining of the lung, like the pleura. This is going to be the abdomen, and so the organs inside of it, so the stomach, the small intestine, large intestine, and females, the uterus, the kidneys, the liver. All of these end up being visceral organs on the inside there. And they can all be similar in the way that they sense things, because a lot of times sensations can be vague and somewhat poorly localized within the organs of the thorax and the abdomen. These sensations are very important for maintaining homeostasis by securing substances for nutrition and fluid balance, so hunger and thirst, trying to get in things you need to keep your energy and your water levels correct in the body. It's also very important for things like breathing, so actually bringing oxygen in to the body. Also, these sensations can become very important for removing waste from the body, so sensations for things like urination and defecation. It's important to know that they can be vague and poorly localized at times. Some things you do know, like when you have to urinate, so some of these can tell you differences between urination and defecation. But actually, sometimes the body actually does confuse things like hunger and thirst. So that's where they can be kind of vague and poorly localized. Also, pain in those areas where we have visceral sensations is generally vague and poorly localized. So some of these things that you will see, we've already spoke about, is hunger, thirst, and then what we know is visceral stretch. So this would be things like the GI tract, like a gas bubble, stretching the intestine and causing some mild discomfort, or the sensation of needing to defecate because the rectum is stretched out because it's full of feces, or the need to urinate because the bladder is full and it has that stretch and that need to release the contents of it through urination. Next is touch and pressure. So we have tactile sense, which ends up being the sensation of something in contact with the surface of the body. So this could be like something lightly pressing or rubbing up against a hair, or walking or moving across the surface of the skin. Pressure is usually more of a deeper sensation, while your tactile sense is more superficial. And so pressure is actually something pushing against the body, and the receptors for this are going to be deeper down. It'll be like the Passian corpuscle or Meissner's corpuscle that would actually sense this, located in the dermis and in the hypodermis areas. The body actually will mix sensations from both tactile and pressure responses to come up with things such as light contact, deep pressure, vibration against the skin, or movement of the hair. There are two different ways that the body has receptors to look for temperature. First are those that are superficial on the skin and located in the mucous membranes on the entrance inside the body. And so they're going to detect what changes in temperature there. Is it getting hot outside? Is it cold outside? Did you just eat something that's too hot? Did you just eat something that's too cold? And these are the superficial ways that the body will sense temperature, which is different than what we look for with central detection of temperature in the body, or what would be known as core temperature detection. And so this is actually receptors in the hypothalamus in the brain that actually look at what the temperature of the blood is and decides what your temperature is. Is it the correct temperature for your body? If your body's too cold, your body will have a reaction to what we call hypothermia, which is being too cold, and the central nervous system is going to do things to try to raise your body temperature. If you have a fever and your temperature is too high and you have what's known as hyperthermia, then the body's going to try to do things through the brain to actually lower your body temperature. And so the brain can do things like cause sweating or increase respirations. Sometimes the body's ability to regulate temperature is thrown off by disease, such as infection, when the body can get really high temperatures in the form of a fever, trying to get rid of that infection. And this could lead to life-threatening conditions for the animal. Pain is actually known as nociception, and so there are pain receptors throughout the body known as nociceptors. They're widely distributed, both inside and outside. Two areas of the body that actually lack pain receptors end up being the brain and the heart. Some of these are just very simple nerve endings. Others are very complex, and the body has different ways that it's looking for pain. It can be through direct trauma, so like pressure, maybe like inserting a needle into the body, and that pressure ends up causing pain. It can also be from inflammation and destruction of tissue inside the body. The big thing with pain is it's there to actually try to protect the body. And so there's physiological processes that come along with pain where the body's actually trying to stop tissue damage and try to promote healing. And then there's also the symptoms and the effects we know on the nervous system where we have pain, and that's trying to limit voluntary movement of that area of the body that's either injured or inflamed. So we have what's known as the pain process here, or you'll learn later on it's also known as the pain pathway. And we have four major steps. We have transduction, transmission, modulation, and perception. So transduction is the location of the injury. So right here we're looking at maybe a dog's toe that just got quicked. And so where we have transduction, the injury occurs and is going to cause a release of inflammatory mediators that are going to stimulate nerves. They're going to be afferent, and they're going to take the signal from that area of injury, of transduction, and they're going to go to the next step, which is transmission, and they're going to take that impulse and they're going to send it to the central nervous system. So with transmission, we're actually taking that pain signal from the site of injury and taking it to the central nervous system, where it's going to go to the spinal cord. And the spinal cord is going to do something called modulation. And with modulation, the spinal cord is going to take that impulse and send it up to the brain. Also, along with modulation can be reflexes. So a lot of times when we have modulation occurring in response to pain, we also can have a reflex action to protect the body against what's causing that pain. Lastly, we have perception, and this is where the brain actually is going to recognize pain and can localize pain to a region or area of the body. Things like visceral pain is kind of poorly isolated and localized to the brain. And so if you have an injury to the gastrointestinal system, it causes the whole abdomen to hurt, just not that specific organ. Whereas what we know as somatic pain, which would be like muscle, bone, and skin, the body can be actually very specific and locate that area specifically in pain receptors in the brain there. And so the body would know if you cut your hand that it's going to be, say, your right hand and maybe right at the palm area, and that's the area that's sore, while the rest of the hand would not actually have any pain to it. When we look at pain, we will classify pain. It can be superficial, which means like on the surface of the skin, deep, which would be like bone and muscle, and then visceral, so things like your abdominal and thoracic organs and the viscera attached to those. We can also look at length of time. So acute pain is immediate, it's occurring right now, and it's short duration. Generally, we define it being shorter than anywhere from, depending on which book you look in, can be less than 24 hours to less than 72 hours. Pain can also be chronic, which is ongoing, long-standing pain. So that can be any pain that would go beyond, depending on which book and which author, 24 to 72 hours, and it's an ongoing process over a long period of time. Lastly, we get the proprioception, and so this is knowing where the body is at and the position of the body at all times and the movement of the body. And so this is things such as position of the head and trunk of the body, knowing where the limbs are at, knowing where the body's at in motion, knowing what position the joints are in, knowing what state the muscles are in contraction or relaxation, and pressure being exerted on things like tendons and ligaments. So that was an overview of the general senses, and next we're going to go into special senses and the organs of special senses.